July 1944, a hedgerow in Normandy, 2 kilometers south of St. Lo. The crew of a German 75 PaK 40 anti-tank gun has been in this position for 9 hours. They have dug the trails into the embankment. They have cut the branches above the muzzle to give the gun a clear lane down a dirt track. They have stacked 30 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition in the slit trench behind the breach. They are veterans of the Eastern Front, of Italy, and now of the bitter, close-range fighting in the bocage country of Calvados. They know exactly what they are doing. At approximately 1500 hours, an American M4 Sherman tank from the 3rd Armored Division noses its way cautiously around the bend of the sunken lane. The PaK 40 fires a single round. The high-velocity 75 shell penetrates the right side of the Sherman just below the turret ring with a shattering crack of tortured steel. The tank shudders to a stop. Thick, oily smoke begins to pour from the open hatches. 2 of the crew manage to scramble out and tumble into the relative safety of a drainage ditch. The other 3 do not emerge. The PaK 40 crew waits, their ears ringing. This is the moment that, in everything they have been trained for, in everything their hard-won experience has taught them from the frozen steppes of Russia to the sun-baked valleys of Italy, they are supposed to displace. Pull the gun back, hook it to the half-track, and disappear to the alternate position before the American artillery can find their coordinates. They do not get the chance. Within roughly 4 minutes, the bare minimum time it takes to limber the gun and get it moving, 2 American P-47 Thunderbolts come screaming in low from the northwest. The first one drops a 500-pound bomb that detonates on the lane with a concussive thump that shakes the ground. The second strafes the hedgerow with a full burst from its 8.50 caliber machine guns, the heavy slugs shredding foliage and steel alike. When a squad of American infantry cautiously moves up to the position 30 minutes later, they find the gun. They find the stacked ammunition. They find what is left of the crew. And here is the thing that should disturb you. This was not a fluke. It was not a single instance of terrible luck for a veteran crew. This happened over and over and over again across the blood-soaked summer of 1944. German anti-tank crews would set up positions that, by every principle of camouflage and fieldcraft doctrine inherited from World War I and refined through 5 years of continuous combat, should have been completely undetectable. The PaK 40 used specially engineered, low-flash propellants, so its muzzle blast would be difficult to spot. The gun itself sat low, just over a meter tall at the gun shield. Crews chose the most cunning reverse slope positions in hedgerows and tree lines, in the shadows of ancient stone barns. They were, without question, the best in the world at this brutal, defensive form of warfare, and yet the Americans found them every single time. German interrogation records from late 1944, conducted with survivors pulled from the shattered remnants of their divisions, use a particular word again and again when crews are asked to describe what happened to them. The word is unbegreiflich, incomprehensible. They could intellectually understand being outnumbered. They could grimly accept being outgunned by a massive industrial war machine. What they could not understand, what haunted the survivors for decades, was how the moment they fired that first perfectly aimed shell, something swift and terrible would come out of the sky specifically for them. Some German officers were convinced the Americans had a new, secret electronic homing device. Others believed the French resistance was signaling their positions from the ground with hidden mirrors. A paranoid few even whispered of traitors inside the Wehrmacht. The men who survived the war and wrote their memoirs would still be puzzling over it 30 and 40 years later. They had been systematically beaten by something they could feel but never quite see. This is the story of what was actually finding them. To explain it, we need to go back to a problem that no army on Earth had solved before that summer, and to a small, unorthodox group of Americans who solved it by ignoring almost every rule about how a modern army was supposed to work. Before we can understand how those guns kept getting found with such lethal speed, we have to understand why their crews were so supremely confident they would remain invisible, because confidence is the right word. The German anti-tank service in 1944 was not a paranoid force. It was not a fearful one, not yet. The men sitting behind those split-trail carriages believed, with very good reason, that they manned the most effective weapon system in the Wehrmacht's defensive arsenal. The PaK 40 was the gun the German army built after the profound shock of Operation Barbarossa, when the older, lighter PaK 38 had failed catastrophically against the sloped armor of the Soviet T-34. Production began in 1942 with a sense of extreme urgency. By the time Allied forces hit the Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944, more than 23,000 PaK 40s had been manufactured and distributed to front-line units. It was the standard, heavy anti-tank weapon on every front, from the frozen north of Finland to the rubble of Monte Cassino. Captured guns would go on to serve in the Red Army, in the Finnish armed forces, and in post-war proxy conflicts as late as Vietnam, a testament to its brutal effectiveness. The math of its lethality was unforgiving and coldly reassuring to its crews. A PaK 40 firing standard Panzergranate 39 armor-piercing ammunition could penetrate roughly 120 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor at a range of 500 meters. The frontal armor of an M4 Sherman, a tank the Americans themselves called a Ronson for its tendency to catch fire, was a maximum of 51 millimeters thick. The calculation was stark and simple. A Sherman crew, no matter how brave, no matter how well trained, was in a state of lethal danger from the instant. A well-concealed PaK 40 had it in its sights at any reasonable battlefield range. The rate of fire was a punishing 14 rounds a minute from a well-drilled crew of 6 men, gunner, loader, commander, and 3 ammunition handlers working in a synchronized rhythm of controlled violence. The doctrine for using the gun was equally well thought out and ruthlessly practical. PaK 40 batteries did not charge forward with attacking panzer grenadiers. They were, by their very nature, defensive weapons of ambush and withdrawal. They were sighted with meticulous care on likely tank approach routes, roads, narrow lanes, and the small breaks in the bocage hedgerows, where a Sherman would be forced to slow down and expose its thinner flank armor. Fields of fire were carefully interlocked so that a single tank column could be engaged from multiple angles simultaneously. The guns were dug in terrifyingly low, so low that often only the sloped armored shield and a few inches of the barrel showed above the dark, damp Norman earth. The shields themselves were painted in the late-war ambush camouflage pattern of beige, green, and red-brown, breaking up their silhouette against the dappled light. The barrels were draped with freshly cut branches or hay from the surrounding fields. And here is the critical technical detail that mattered more than almost any other. German anti-tank gun propellant in 1944 was a marvel of chemical engineering, specifically formulated to produce a minimal muzzle flash and almost no lingering white smoke. American tankers who fought against them have written about this in their memoirs for 80 years. You did not see a PaK 40 fire, not in the way you see a weapon fire in a film. You saw your friend's tank suddenly stop with a lurch, a neat dark hole punched in its side, and then a second or two later you heard the sharp, distant crack of the gun's report. The projectile could arrive before the sound did. The first sign that a lethal threat existed was a burning Sherman with its surviving crew scrambling for cover. There were German crews so proficient at this grim art that they became legendary within their own divisions, their kill rings painted on the gun barrel like fighter aces. The terrain itself made the situation exponentially worse for the attacking American. The bocage of Calvados, that dense, ancient labyrinth of earth and vegetation walls, some of them 1,000 years old, divided every field from every other field into a claustrophobic series of natural fortresses. The hedgerows were not mere bushes. They were impenetrable earthen dikes, 4 to 6 feet thick at the base, crowned with a tangled thicket of hawthorn, bramble, and sapling trees. The Germans simply moved into this pre-built defensive landscape and occupied it. Every sunken lane was a potential kill zone. Every field junction was an interlocking trap. American tanks that attempted to cross an open pasture could expect to be hit before they reached the far side, taken from a flank they could not see. The British military theorist J.F.C. Fuller, writing about Normandy after the war, described the bocage as one of the most inherently defensible pieces of terrain any modern army had ever been ordered to assault. The German crews knew all of this. They knew the mathematics of armor penetration. They knew their doctrine was superb. They knew the ground favored them absolute. And in the early weeks of the Normandy campaign, the math worked exactly as predicted. American armored battalions took catastrophic, morale-sapping losses to hidden anti-tank fire. Whole tank companies, a dozen Shermans or more, were destroyed in single, disastrous afternoons. The names of the killing grounds became infamous. Hill 192, the road to St. Froment. By late June, the 3rd Armored Division reported casualty rates in its lead Sherman companies approaching a staggering 70%. The planned Allied breakout was 3 weeks behind schedule and falling further behind every day. A sense of grim stalemate, reminiscent of the First World War, began to settle over the bridgehead. And then something began to change. It did not change all at once with a great dramatic fanfare. It did not change because of any single decisive battle. It changed in a way that, from the German side, looking out through their camouflage netting, looked at first like a run of bad luck, except that the luck kept happening and kept happening and kept happening until the sweat-soaked men behind the gun shields began to understand, with a cold, creeping dread, that whatever was finding them was not luck at all. What changed first was nothing the Germans could easily see or touch. It was a small, unarmed, fabric-covered airplane painted olive drab, flying at a leisurely 90 miles an hour, roughly 2,000 feet above the constantly shifting front lines. There were dozens of them, buzzing like like insects over the patchwork of fields. They were the slowest combat aircraft on the entire battlefield, and they were utterly unarmored, a fragile construction of welded steel tube and Irish linen. The Germans called them little flies and shot at them with everything they had. 88mm flak guns fired time-fused shells that burst into black puffs around them. 20mm automatic cannons sent streams of tracer arcing up from the tree lines. Even desperate infantrymen fired their Mauser rifles at them, watching the tiny specks of light wink past. Not many of the flies were knocked down. The ones that survived a single combat mission were considered valuable beyond reckoning, because what those absurdly fragile little airplanes were doing was fundamentally changing what it meant to fire a gun in a hedgerow. The German anti-tank crews who fought in Normandy that summer did not truly know what they were looking at when they squinted up at one of those olive drab specks. They were looking at the answer to the central question of their own impending destruction. They just could not see the full, terrifying machine yet. To understand why, you have to understand what those little flies actually were, who flew them, and the revolutionary equipment they had in their cockpits that no other army on Earth had managed to put there. The airplane was the Piper L-4 Grasshopper. It was the militarized version of the Piper J-3 Cub, the small, bright yellow trainer that thousands of young Americans had learned to fly in during the 1930s, spending a few dollars for an hour in the sky. The transformation was brutally simple. Strip away the cheerful chrome yellow paint, slap on a dull coat of olive drab and invasion stripes, cut a few plexiglass windows into the rear fuselage so the backseat passenger could peer straight down at the ground between his feet, and you had the United States Army's answer to a problem nobody else had quite figured out how to solve. The problem was deceptively simple to state and brutally hard to overcome. Modern artillery, by the summer of 1944, had become so lethally accurate and so devastatingly powerful that the limiting factor was no longer the guns themselves. It was the eyes. Whoever could see the target first could kill it. The trouble was that the front lines of a major mechanized war were vast, chaotic, and constantly shifting. The American sector in Normandy alone covered dozens of miles, and a human being on the ground, even one standing on the roof of a barn, could see only a few hundred yards in any direction, far less in the claustrophobic green corridors of the bocage. The Germans had thought about this problem. They had the Fieseler Storch, a brilliant liaison aircraft with a remarkably low stalling speed that could land almost anywhere. But the Storch was controlled by the Luftwaffe. The Wehrmacht had to formally request its services through a slow, bureaucratic chain of command. And by mid-1944, the Luftwaffe had been so chewed to pieces over the skies of the Reich that the Storch barely flew over Normandy at all. The system was broken. What the Americans had done that no other army had managed was to put the airplanes inside the artillery itself. This was the organizational revolution. The field artillery branch, not the Army Air Forces, owned the L-4s. Every single artillery battalion in the United States Army was authorized 2 of them, along with 2 pilots and 1 dedicated mechanic. The pilots were not borrowed from some separate elite flying corps. They were field artillery officers, men who had been trained first as gunners and fire direction specialists, and then taught to fly a fragile little plane. They understood guns from the inside out, intuitively. They knew how a fire mission was built from the ground up. When they keyed their radio microphone and called a correction to a battery miles behind the lines, they were speaking the exact same technical language as the men sweating over the howitzers putting the rounds down range. There was no translation, no delay, no loss of meaning. By the summer of 1944, more than 2,700 L-4s served with American forces in the European theater. Some 900 of them would be lost in action or in accidents, a staggering casualty rate for an unarmed observation unit. The men who flew them developed a particular, fatalistic kind of nerve. Captain John Johnson, who flew an L-4 with the XII Corps Artillery in Patton's Third Army, would later describe a war fought at 200 feet above the ground in an unarmored airplane built of fabric and prayer. Most of the time when the Germans spotted him, they shot at him with 88mm flak. The fuse on an 88 round was often set to explode at a certain altitude, and if it went off close, the concussion alone could snap the fragile Cub's wings off. Johnson and his fellow pilots developed a desperate kind of evasive flying that involved diving sharply, side-slipping the airplane into narrow valleys, and using the natural folds of the Norman ground as cover, hedge-hopping like terrified rabbits. Bruce Gale, another L-4 pilot, eventually, and without official approval, installed homemade bazooka rails under his wing struts, feeling it gave him a fighting chance against the anti-aircraft guns that hunted him relentlessly. The most famous of all was Charles Carpenter, a former history teacher from Illinois, 29 years old when he enlisted, assigned to the 4th Armored Division. Carpenter's reputation in his division was that he was clinically insane in the most useful possible way. He bolted 6 bazookas to the wing struts of his Cub, named it Rossi the Rocketeer, and used it to dive-bomb German armored vehicles at angles approaching 80 degrees, pulling out at a terrifying 1,500 feet. His divisional reports credit him with disabling multiple German tanks and armored cars. His superiors did not officially encourage what he was doing. They did not stop him either. This is the place where it is worth pausing. The story of the L-4 is not the romantic, rogue story of one pilot strapping bazookas to a trainer. The real story is what the airplane allowed the entire lethal system to do. When a PaK 40 fired its first round in a hedgerow, the muzzle blast, even with low flash powder, produced a small but distinct physical disturbance. Dust and dried leaves lifted into the air. A faint puff of smoke drifted for a few seconds before dissipating. Freshly cut branches laid over the barrel shifted slightly from the recoil. None of this would be visible to a tank commander buttoned up in a Sherman 500 yards away, his vision restricted to the tiny, sweat-fogged periscope of his cupola. He was effectively blind, but it was visible from above at 2,000 feet to a patient man with a pair of high-powered binoculars and a gridded map on his knee. And the moment that man had the precise coordinates, he could speak calmly into a radio handset. What happened next depended on a system that took American artillery doctrine and made it operate at the speed of war. The Fire Direction Center, the technical brain of the artillery battalion, a doctrine inherited from decades of rigorous work done at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. A single, concise radio call from an aerial observer could mask the coordinated fire of multiple battalions onto a single set of map coordinates inside of 3 to 4 minutes. From the German gun crew's perspective, down in the dirt and the leaves, they had fired a single shell. From the American perspective, that single shell had just signed their death warrant with their own muzzle blast. The eyes were not on the ground, struggling to peer through a hedgerow. They were 2,000 feet up, looking down at the whole bloody chessboard. But there was a critical life or death problem with the L-4 system, and the German crews who were smart and fast enough to survive their first encounter with it began, at first dimly, to understand what it was. Artillery, no matter how efficient, takes minutes. An L-4 could call in a fire mission and have rounds impacting in 3 or 4 minutes. That was a revolution in speed, but it was still minutes. A skilled, veteran PaK 40 crew could, in that narrow window of time, hook up the gun to its half-track, displace from the position, and be moving down a pre-scouted lane to an alternate firing point in less than that. The geometry of the chase had been fundamentally changed, but the trap had not been finished. The loop was not yet closed. Something else was needed to close that final gap, to eliminate those last crucial minutes. Something that could put an explosive weapon directly on top of a hidden gun within seconds, not minutes. And that something was sitting in a Quonset hut in southern England in early 1944, being urgently argued about by a maverick brigadier general named Pete Quesada and an army group commander named Omar Bradley. What they were about to propose had never been done before in the history of warfare. They were about to collapse the time it took to kill a hidden gun from minutes to seconds, and in doing so, they would make the German anti-tank doctrine of fire and displace completely and utterly obsolete. The full, crushing weight of the American system was about to arrive, and the men behind the PaK 40 shields in the quiet Norman lanes had no idea it was coming. His name was Elwood Richard Quesada, but to his friends, to the men who served under him, and to the army he was trying to change, he was simply Pete. By the spring of 1944, he had been promoted to Major General and given command of the IX Tactical Air Command, the fighter-bomber arm of the 9th Air Force, the air component that would directly support the American First Army in the upcoming invasion of France. Quesada was an unusual, almost heretical figure inside the rigid culture of the Army Air Forces. The Air Forces in 1944 were dominated culturally and doctrinally by the strategic bomber craft, the men who believed with evangelical certainty that the way to win the war was to put 1,000 bomber raids over Berlin and Hamburg and Schweinfurt, to smash the enemy's industrial heart from 20,000 feet. Close air support, the dirty, dangerous, low-altitude work of dropping bombs and firing rockets in direct support of mud-covered soldiers on the ground, was considered by many of those high-altitude purists to be a gross misuse of expensive aircraft and highly trained pilots. Quesada thought this was not just wrong, but morally bankrupt. He believed at his core that an air force which could not directly and immediately help the men dying in the dirt below it was an air force that had forgotten what it was for. He flew into Normandy the day after D-Day and set up his forward headquarters in a tent next to Omar Bradley's 1st Army command post. Bradley, for his part, was famously dismissive of the silk scarf attitude he had encountered in some Air Force liaison officers in earlier campaigns. He liked Quesada immediately for his blunt, profane, and relentlessly practical manner. What Quesada Quesada saw in the first grinding weeks of the Normandy fighting was a war in which the ground forces and the air forces were fighting two completely parallel and disconnected battles. The fighter-bomber pilots would take off from their bases in England with general target lists, fly across the channel, find what they could find through the drifting smoke and cloud, and drop their ordnance on. If a Sherman company was being eaten alive by hidden anti-tank guns at exactly the moment a flight of P-47s flew directly overhead, the pilots usually had no idea. There was simply no way for them to know. There was no shared radio frequency. There was no shared map reference system. The pilots talked to other pilots. The tankers talked to other tankers. The two services were physically in the same airspace above the same blood-soaked battlefield, and they were tactically deaf and mute to each other. It was a grotesque failure of coordination. In late June or early July of 1944, the exact date is still debated by historians, Quesada went to Bradley with a proposal so radical it would have horrified almost every senior officer in either service if it had been presented through normal, bureaucratic channels. Quesada wanted to take a VHF radio set straight out of a P-47 Thunderbolt, specifically the SCR 522 set, the standard crystal-controlled radio for American single-engine fighters, and physically bolted into the turret of an M4 Sherman tank. He wanted to put a fighter pilot in full flight gear inside that tank, and he wanted that pilot, riding in the lead tank of an armored column, to be able to talk directly to other pilots flying P-47s overhead in the same vocabulary, on the same frequency, in real time. Bradley, by every account that survives of that meeting in a dusty tent in Normandy, agreed almost on the spot. He understood the tactical implications instantly. Two M4 Shermans were sent to IXTAC headquarters within hours for the rapid cut and weld modification. By the end of July 1944, the system had a name. It was called Armored Column Cover, and here is how it worked with devastating simplicity in practice. A combat command of an American armored division, say Combat Command A of the 2nd Armored Division, would have 3 dedicated air support parties. One rode with the division commander. The 2 others rode directly with the lead combat commands. Each party included an air liaison officer, almost always a young fighter pilot from the Army Air Forces, who now rode inside a specially modified Sherman tank. The tank had 2 radios. One was the standard SCR 528 tank-to-tank radio that the tank commander used to talk to his platoon. The other was the SCR 522, pulled directly out of a P-47, that the air liaison officer used to talk to the fighter-bomber flight orbiting somewhere above the clouds. A flight of 4 P-47 Thunderbolts would fly a protective pattern above the advancing armored column, typically at 5,000 to 7,000 feet, low enough to see the ground clearly through the breaks in the overcast, high enough to be relatively safe from light flak. When the column came under sudden ambush fire, the air liaison officer in the lead Sherman, who could see the tracers and the muzzle flashes with his own eyes, would key the fighter frequency radio. He would describe the target in the language of a pilot. He would, if necessary, fire a round of colored smoke from a mortar mounted on his tank in the direction of the German position, marking it visually for the men above. The flight leader would acknowledge, peel off, identify the colored smoke or the specific hedgerow corner described, and roll in for the attack. From the German anti-tank crew's perspective, the timing was no longer survivable. The entire fire and displace doctrine assumed several minutes, a bare minimum of 3 to 5, between firing the first round and receiving retaliatory fire. Quesada's system collapsed that interval down to seconds. The first shell told the Sherman where the gun was. The Sherman told the P-47, and the P-47, circling like a hawk, was already on top of them. Quesada's own description of what he had built was characteristically blunt and entirely free of military jargon. According to his biographer, Thomas Alexander Hughes, he told Bradley that this arrangement would put ground-to-air direction in language the fighter boy in the air can understand. This was the entire point, not a translation through layers of intermediaries and Corps headquarters clerks, not a formal request passed through 3 different radio nets, a pilot in a tank talking directly to a pilot in a plane, both of them looking at the same German gun from different angles, about to destroy it with a shared, instantaneous decision. The Germans did not have a comparable system. To understand why is to understand something fundamental about how the 2 warring militaries differ. The Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe were separate services with deeply entrenched, competing command structures and a long, bitter history of bureaucratic rivalry and mutual contempt. Putting a Luftwaffe pilot inside a Wehrmacht Panzer with a Luftwaffe radio tuned to a Luftwaffe frequency would have required personally signed orders from people at the highest levels who fundamentally did not get along and who guarded their authority with paranoid jealousy. By the time anything could have been agreed upon, the Luftwaffe over Normandy was effectively dead anyway. The American system worked because Quesada and Bradley operated in a pragmatic, results-driven culture that allowed them to bypass the official channels entirely. 2 Shermans, 1 handshake agreement in a tent, 1 decision that did not go to Washington, and 3 weeks later, the system was operational across the entire First Army front. By the time the Great Breakout from Normandy began on July 25, 1944, every American armored division had air support parties of this kind. The German crews behind their PaK 40s did not know it yet, sheltered under their camouflage nets. But the geometry of the hedgerow war had just been rewritten in a way that would not be reversed. They were no longer fighting a tank. They were fighting a network, and the network had just closed its fist. What it looked like when the new system arrived at full, terrifying strength is a thing best told through the experience of one specific German formation in one specific place over a few specific, catastrophic days at the end of July 1944. The place was called Rancy, and what happened there would become a legend among the men who flew the fighter-bombers and a nightmare for the men trapped on the ground below. At 9:40 hours on the morning of July 25, 1944, the largest tactical air bombardment of the European war up to that point began. Approximately 1,500 B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers, with another 1,000 medium bombers and fighter bombers in support, dropped roughly 3,300 tons of high explosive and fragmentation bombs on a narrow strip of Normandy countryside about 3 miles wide and 1 mile deep just west of St. Lo. The target was the Panzer Lehr Division, the elite German armored training division that had been rushed to Normandy and ordered to hold the line against the American breakout at all costs. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, the division commander, described what happened in post-war interrogations with a kind of hollow shock. His entire division, the pride of the German armored force, was reduced to what he called a Mondlandschaft, a moonscape, within 90 minutes. Craters touched rim to rim. All signal communications were cut. Several of his men, he reported with clinical detachment, went mad and ran out into the open until shrapnel killed them. This is the part of the Operation Cobra story that is usually told. The carpet bombing shatters the line. The American breakout begins. It is true, but it is not the part that answers our central question. The carpet bombing happened once, a single massive blow. The thing that systematically destroyed the PaK 40 crews happened every single day for the next 2 weeks in a way the men dying inside it found utterly incomprehensible. By July 28, 3 days after the carpet bombing, the German front in the western half of Normandy had not just been broken, it had been functionally disintegrated. 6 German divisions, or the shattered remnants of them, found themselves caught in a desperate fleeing pocket south of Coutances, centered on the village of Rancy. They were trying to retreat eastward before the trap closed completely. To do that, they had to move on the narrow, sunken roads. They had to move during daylight because moving at night with broken down, shot-up vehicles was impossibly slow, and the Americans were advancing faster than they could retreat in the dark. They had absolutely no Luftwaffe cover, and waiting for them, orbiting 2,000 feet above the road network, were the air liaison parties of the American 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, calmly talking on their SCR 522 radios to flights of He-47 Thunderbolts that had been on station since dawn, refueled and rearmed in a continuous cycle of destruction. What followed on the afternoon and evening of July 29 is one of the most concentrated and devastating demonstrations of air-ground integration in the history of warfare. Around the village of Rancy, on a single, desperate German column trying to break out to the east, the P-47 Thunderbolts of the 405th Fighter Group destroyed a documented 122 tanks, 259 other vehicles, and 11 artillery pieces. RAF Typhoons of the 2nd Tactical Air Force, called in by the same radio network, flew 99 sorties in the same area and claimed 17 more tanks destroyed. By the time the Rancy pocket was reduced on July 30th, more than 7,500 German troops had been killed or captured. More than 250 vehicles and over 100 tanks lay destroyed, abandoned, or still burning on the narrow, choked roads. The survivors who straggled out of the pocket were hollow-eyed, deafened, and spoke of an attack that came from everywhere at once. A young officer of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, named Fritz Langang, 25 years old, a veteran of 7 years of brutal combat in the SS, lived through Rancy and gave a detailed, reflective interview about it years later. Langang commanded a platoon of 4 Panthers attached to a reinforced battle group. His description of the breakout attempt is the description of a man trying to escape from inside a system he could not see. The edges of the roads were constantly burning. Vehicles in front of him exploded for reasons that did not always involve any visible attacker, just a sudden, blinding flash and a column of black smoke. When his column tried to detour onto smaller country lanes, those lanes had been hit too. When it tried to move at night, daylight came with brutal swiftness and the lanes were hit again. Langenk survived. Most of the men around him did not. Pause. The diary of a flak unit attached to the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, captured intact after the battle, describes the same situation from another, equally terrified angle. The text was later translated and published by historian Richard Hargreaves. Mild confusion in all units. Roads clogged with burning vehicles. Heavy losses caused by Jabo attacks since we have to move by daylight to escape encirclement. Jabo, short for Jagbomber, Hunter Bomber, was the universal Wehrmacht word for the American P-47 and the British Typhoon. By the diary's description, the entire valley appeared to be on fire, with thick black columns of oily smoke rising from shot-up vehicles and ammunition cooking off inside them in staccato, crackling bursts. Now we can give the title of this video its full and final answer, because the question was never really just about anti-tank guns. It was about a particular, haunting German experience. The experience of being inside a competent, well-trained, well-equipped military formation and being systematically beaten by something you could feel happening to you but could not explain. The answer is that the men behind the gun shields were seeing the scattered consequences of a system, but never the system itself. They saw an airplane and cursed it. They did not see that the airplane was being flown by a field artillery officer who had been to gunnery school at Fort Sill and who was talking on a radio to a battalion fire direction center that could mass 12 batteries on a single coordinate in 3 minutes. They saw a Sherman tank and engaged it. They did not see that the tank had a fighter pilot in its turret holding an SCR 522 microphone connected directly to a flight of P-47s orbiting at 6,000 feet. They saw rockets and bombs falling from the sky. They did not see that the bombs had been called in by a man named Weiss on a hill they could not capture. The German anti-tank crews of 1944 had been trained to fight a battle of weapon against weapon. What they encountered instead was a battle of system against weapon, and a better system, as the old observation goes, beats a braver army every single time. Pete Quesada survived the war. He retired as a lieutenant general, a visionary largely unknown to the public he served. He died in 1993. Robert Weiss came home from Hill 314, finished his education quietly, and wrote a memoir called Fire Mission that every student of modern warfare should read. Charles Carpenter came home, returned to teaching high school history in Illinois, and died in 1966. His insane courage in a fabric-covered airplane a fading memory among his former students. Fritz Langenk survived the war, was interviewed decades later, and tried with the honesty of a former enemy to describe what had happened to his men at Ronsi. He did his best. He could not fully explain it even then. That is the verdict. The German anti-tank crews could not explain what was killing them because what was killing them was not a thing. It was a network. It was a working agreement between two generals in a tent made lethally functional through the coordinated labor of thousands of pilots, gunners, radio operators, and engineers. Every individual American technology in this story had a German equivalent. The PaK 40 outranged most American tank guns. The Tiger and the Panther vastly outclassed the Sherman in armor and firepower. The 88mm flak gun could reach the L-4's altitude. The Wehrmacht had the Storch liaison aircraft. The Luftwaffe had perfectly serviceable radios. What the Germans did not have, and what they could not improvise under the relentless pressure of total air superiority, were the connections between them. The PaK 40 in the hedgerow did not lose to a better gun. It lost to a way of thinking about how guns and airplanes and radios and tanks and forward observers could be organized into a single, seamless, and utterly devastating weapon. It lost to a system whose individual parts the crew could see and whose totality the crew could not. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.